with what I think is one of these controversial topics, especially nowadays, in this idea of pluralism and how we have to validate everyone's worldview and we can't say anybody's wrong and we have to sort of tiptoe around our differences. And Cameron, both Cameron and Alicia actually touched on this during their talks about how do we have discussions about our deepest differences without being disagreeable. And this topic of is Jesus the only way? How do you talk about other religious systems? How do you do it respectfully, yet in a way that shows there's differences? Sort of reminds me of a story. There was, you've heard this path, this claim. All roads lead to God. All roads are equally valid. All roads lead to God. There's many paths up the mountain, et cetera, et cetera. You name your cliche, people have said it about why all systems of belief are actually true. Well, a friend of mine was at a Christian conference, and it's a big Christian conference where a lot of people were wearing these lanyards and these badges, where they'd come down and they'd sit at the restaurants, and they were ordering their food in this big city, and a waitress is there at the restaurant, and she's taking everybody's order, and she says, "What's with the badges? What is that?" Because the badge said ETS on it, and she said, "What in the heck is ETS?" And he said, "It's the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting." Well, that's quite a mouthful. Evangelical Theological Society meeting. They get paid by the syllable, apparently. So based on that, she said, "Oh, is that a religious thing?" And he said, "Well, yeah, sure. It's a religious thing. A bunch of Christian nerds get together and talk about Christian nerdy things." And she said, "That's fascinating. I love talking about religion. I think all religions lead to God." Now, she said that's the wrong guy. Because he said, "Really? How do you know?" And she said, "Well, they all teach love and goodness, and everyone, should be good to each other, and good people go to heaven." He said, "Really? So how do you know that? How do you know they all teach that? Have you studied all the world religions?" And she said, well, no, but I know people from different religions, and they tend to be good people, and they believe you should be good to each other." He said, "Yeah, but how do you know the religion says that, not just the people?" And she had no idea whatsoever. She was completely stunned into silence, and it got uncomfortable and weird. So he said, "Okay, I'll have the brisket, whatever." But the point is that this cliche that we hear all the time, all roads lead to God, is often said by people who haven't really thought it through. Because they say all roads lead to God, and therefore all worldviews are equally valid. But then when you come to the Christian scripture, you find something very stark and unique about what the Christian scripture says in the way it says it. When you read John chapter 14, verse 6, what does Jesus say in this incredibly well-known passage? He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me." Every word of that sentence is important because it summarizes Christian exclusivity. It says, "I," so he's referring to himself, "am," not hope to be or claim to be, but I am, I exist. I am the exclusive way. There is a way, the truth, there's only one truth, and the life. Every single one of those words is important because he makes a claim about himself to be the exclusive means by which we have the way, from whom the truth comes, and how we have life. No one comes to the Father but by me. That's an exclusive statement. He didn't say a way, a truth, a life. Some people come to the Father through me. That word Father, by the way, when he uses the word Father, that's a uniquely Christian idea. Muslims would never agree that God is our Father. There's tons of exclusiveness right into the statement, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And then in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, Peter, after having come to a true faith now, having seen the risen Christ, is standing in front of a bunch of people who don't believe in the risen Jesus, and he's proclaiming to them that he is the Messiah. He says, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." Pretty stark. So if someone says, well, Christianity is not exclusive, well, by whose standards? By yours or by Jesus? Or by Peter's standards? Because they seem pretty clear. He's the only way to salvation. All other methods of salvation are just wrong. This is an interesting thing because I was doing a fundraiser actually here, not here, but in Tulsa, a few months back when I was here the last time. And as I was giving this talk on, I think, the sufficiency and a uniqueness of Christian claims, there was somebody there who happened to be a pantheist. someone who comes from an Eastern background, an Eastern mindset, and she was saying, no, all paths lead to God. And I was saying, well, Christianity says that only one path leads to God. Does that path lead to God? And she said, well, I don't necessarily agree with it. I'm like, oh, so you disagree. We went back and forth on this, and she refused to actually say Christianity was wrong in its exclusivity. She refused to do that. So so I asked her, I said, well, Jesus says this here. He says specifically, he is the way, the truth, and the life. Do you agree with Jesus? Now that's an interesting thing because people often think, well, I think that there's many paths to God. You don't think so. It's not my opinion that matters. I'm not the one who said it. Jesus said it. So I asked her, don't disagree with me or agree with me. I don't care if you agree with me or disagree with me. Who I care you agree about is Jesus. Do you think he was wrong? Now that's a harder question. People don't like disagreeing with Jesus. It's kind of a thing. You don't like to do that. Even atheists have a hard time saying, oh, I don't like what Jesus said. They're getting a little more comfortable with it, but they still have a hard time with it. She said, well, here's what's interesting. I had a dream one day, and Jesus came to me in my dream. And in that dream, he told me that we're all God's inside. There's an inner divinity in all of us. And that's why she's a pantheist. The primary reason is Jesus told her. I said, that's a fascinating story because I have friends who were Hindus who will tell you they had dreams where Jesus came to them and said, all your gods are false gods, and I am the way, the truth, and the life, and you need to recognize you're a sinner in need of a Savior. So their dream told them one thing, and your dream told them another thing. Who's right? And she said, both of us. And I said, how is that possible that we're both right? You see, the very idea she was having a problem with is that truth, by definition, is an exclusive thing. When you claim to have the truth, and she was saying that all paths lead to God, she said that's a true statement. Do you see what she's doing, though? She is disagreeing with everyone else who says they don't all lead to God. When you do that, you're saying, this is the truth, what you're saying is false. So obviously, all paths don't lead to God because you're excluding the exclusivists. And she failed to see the logic there. You see, this claim, all roads lead to God, is a very, I think, frankly, a disrespectful claim. And Cameron touched on this a little bit in his talk as well. When you say this, all paths lead to God, and you don't think critically, you don't think for yourself and trying to understand, do they actually lead to God? You're insulting all these major worldviews. You're insulting every single one of them. Because when you say all the paths lead to God, they don't even claim to lead to God. Let me give you an example. I came from the religion of Islam. When I was growing up as a Muslim, I believed that there was a salvation, that God had prepared for us, a heaven and a paradise. But you know what was missing from that heaven? God himself. In Islam, God does not condescend to interact with you, whether here on earth or in the paradise he's prepared. He does not do that. So you don't get to be with God. The Christian message specifically says that's what you get. Not only do you get a bodily resurrection, but you get to commune with the living God. That's what heaven is. That's why Paul says, eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, nor has entered into the heart of man that which God has prepared for those who love him. Because you can't conceive of what God is like. So do you see the difference? Islam says you get to go to a paradise. Christianity says you get to go and be with God. So all paths don't even lead to God because one says you don't even get to go to God. Take, for example, Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't teach in its classical sense, in the sense that Buddha actually taught, doesn't teach you get to go to God or get to go to heaven. Buddhism is non-theistic. It denies the reality of any kind of a self, let alone a supernatural self, and says your goal in life is not to get to God. Your goal in life is to become nothing, to extinguish. Sort of a strange recruiting poster, but there you have it. You're just an accretion of karma from previous lives, and if you work out that karma over time, following, understanding the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, you'll eventually become nothing. And that's the classical goal. So all roads don't lead to God because this one doesn't even say there is a God. In distinction to Hinduism. Hinduism does say that there is a self, but the problem is that we have forgotten our divinity. Not that there's no self, but that self is divine. And that if you just wake up from the illusion that you're just a person, not actually a divine being, when you wake up from that, you'll eventually achieve enlightenment, and that enlightenment will allow you to be absorbed into the impersonal, absolute creative force of the universe, the Brahman. Those are fundamentally different claims. None of them teaches that you get to go to God except for Christianity. One says you become God, another one says you become nothing, and the other one says you get to go to heaven, which is a sort of a God-ordained but God-less heaven. So they're very different. Now, if you were to say that they're all the same, don't you find yourself insulting all those religious systems? See, every worldview, every single one, every one of them has to answer four main questions of existence to be worth your or my time. Every one of them does. Whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, atheism, whatever it is. And I'm going to focus on three. Atheism or secular humanism, the pantheistic thinking of the East, and Islam, the religion of my birth, and compare it to Christianity to show you just how different they actually are. But they all have to answer four main questions. The first question, how did we get here? Questions of origins. The second question, why are we here? The question of meaning or purpose. The third question, what explains the human condition? You know, why is there suffering? Why is there flourishing? Why is there good? Why is there evil? Why is there a desire for relationship? Why do we mourn the loss of relationship? All these things. What explains the way human beings are and the way the world is? And then fourthly, is there a better life? Is there a salvation? These kinds of things. So first, how do we get here? Second, why are we here? Third, why is here the way here is? And fourth, how do we get out of here? Those are the main questions. And every worldview has to answer all four. Has to answer all four not only in terms of giving an answer to all four, but answering all four in a way that is coherent and makes some kind of sense. If your worldview does not answer all four, then your worldview is deficient. And every single one of the worldviews that are out there, all the religious systems and all the worldviews, answer them fundamentally differently. So they can't all be the same, and they can't all be equally valid. So when you find this out, when you say, look, do all roads lead to God, and you point out the logical reality of it is that they don't even claim to lead to God, you've pointed out a flaw in the thinking. When you say that if we're inclusive of all religious systems, and we believe they're all valid, except those who claim that only one is valid, you've actually excluded somebody. You see what you've done? It's a self-defeating position. You've sawed off the very limb on which you're sitting. You don't have a position really on inclusiveness. Now what happens is postmodernism tells you this. When you point that out, when you point out a flaw in the thinking, you've done what's called a power move. See, postmodernism rejects the idea that we can assert truth claims as dominant over one other truth claim or as better than another truth claim, because to do that is sort of a violence. It does this sort of rhetorical power move on someone else by saying, your worldview is not as valid as mine, or here's a flaw in your thinking. And we can't have that. We have to have this conversation that needs to go on amongst ourselves, and we can't really say who's right and who's wrong. That's considered a power move. The problem with that is that when you do that power move, when you say someone, you've done a power move on me, you've tried to show me the flaw in my own thinking, that's a guilt trip they're laying on you, which itself is a power move. Trying to prevent you from actually engaging critically on these issues is a power move to get you to shut up and not point out the flaws. But the reality is, I respect these worldviews far too much to actually tell them we're all the same. Could you imagine if I were in a conversation with a Muslim, coming from my background as someone who was a Muslim and now is a Christian, and I were to sit there and say, you know, we believe basically the same things. We believe that God is triune, and you don't believe that, but who cares? Well, I believe that God came and condescended to become a man and died on a cross to save me from my sins. You don't believe that. You believe you're saved by your works, and if God has enough mercy on you, you get to go to heaven. But you know what? I don't care about all those differences. We believe the same thing. Do you find that insulting? It is insulting to tell somebody like that your beliefs don't matter. 1,400 years of theological tradition in Islam is simply wiped away because, you know what? I want to get along. That's insulting. To tell a Buddhist and a Hindu that they believe basically the same thing, though they have some common beliefs as well, but to say that they believe basically the same thing, that's just insulting, because Buddhism was started in rejection of certain Hindu doctrines. The founder of Buddhism was actually a Hindu who rejected the idea of the caste system and the idea of the self. And those are both very important to Hinduism. So he rejected those things, found them to be wrong, and founded Buddhism in rejection of those things. To tell a Buddhist and a Hindu they believe the same thing disrespects that entire history. Why would you ever insult somebody by telling them that? And if they don't realize they're being insulted, then maybe they really don't hold that worldview after all. Maybe they don't even know much about their worldview. So going through this stuff is not an insulting thing. It's not a power move. We're not trying to put one over on you and show you that we have this sort of imperialistic, I want to dominate your thinking through my cleverness. It's just, I want to engage honestly and genuinely on the tough stuff and say our differences make a difference, and I respect you enough to recognize your difference and talk with you about them. Now, what are they? I'm going to go through the 4 questions and go through these worldviews and say, how do they answer each question? It's going to be not a blistering pace, but it'll be a little bit. But I wanted to frame them in terms of these 4 questions so we can actually structure what we're talking about. So let's go to the first question. How did we get here? And I'll take secular humanism or atheism first. Secular humanism basically is the worldview that human beings are inherently valuable and have an inherent dignity or an intrinsic worth. That's what humanism actually is. But secular humanism says we don't need God and his existence to affirm that or to ground that idea. They just are valuable. That's why it's called secular humanism. We don't need God to affirm that. Now, the question is this: if there is no God, how did we get here? Now, before I continue on with this one, because this is an important question, I'm going to spend most of my time, I think, on this question. Here's why. How you answer this question, how did we get here, will dictate how you answer every other question. So if you answer how did we get here in a certain way, it will tell you then why we're here. It'll tell you why the way the world is the way it is, and is there a better life? This is a foundational question. So from a secular humanist standpoint, how did we get here? Well, if there is no God and no grand designer, then there is no grand design. If there's no grand design, then we got here either by chance or operation of laws or physical forces or some combination of the two. But there was nothing that thought of you in mind ahead of time. You weren't here because something thought of you. When you look at Stephen Jay Gould, for example, Stephen Jay Gould, he's passed away now. He's a professor of biology and paleontology at I believe it was Harvard. And he basically said, I'm going to summarize his comments about why we're here. He was interviewed and asked about human origins. He says, we are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that made terrestrial walking possible, because an ice age didn't entirely freeze everything over, because comets struck the earth, giving mammals a chance they otherwise didn't have available to them, because a small and tenuous species arising 250,000 years ago in Africa, meaning mammals of course, managed to survive by hook and by crook. And here's the important part. He said, given all this, that it's all basically chance, he says, you may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating, and I'm still not sure how. You may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct the answers from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. That's quite a statement. We got here by accident, and if you're reading the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature, just stop it. You have to construct them yourself, because we're here by accident. I want to put a pin in that, because his answer actually goes back to why are we here. So he says how we got here, but he actually, you can see it as he's describing how we got here. The answer of the question of purpose, he can't help but talk about it from a secular standpoint. So put a pin in that, because he said there is no other way and there is no higher meaning. So let's go to that in a minute. But pantheism's question to the answer to the question, how do we get here, is that basically you were always here. You always existed. You have an inner divinity inside of you. There is a divine being. To quote even the Western versions of pantheistic thought, like Deepak Chopra, he said that each one of us has the seeds of divinity inside of us. We are the gods and goddesses in embryo, waiting to be fully realized. Now, if that's the case, that you have a divinity inside of you, the reason why you exist as a human and not as a god is because you forgot your divinity. I'm not sure how the divine being forgets anything, but apparently you forgot that. There was you somehow got fooled into believing that you're not divine. It's funny, when I asked that woman at that fundraiser I was at, how did you get here in the first place? If you're a divine being. In fact, let me clarify. Pantheism, the name pantheism is this pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. It merely means all is God. So you are not a God in pantheism, you are the God, and so am I. Everything is the God. The chair, the air we're breathing, all is one and all is divine. So I asked her, if you're a divine being, how the heck did you get down here? What happened? Who fooled the divine being? No response. It was just like, well, we're here to enlighten ourselves. I know why we're here, according to you, but how did we get here in the first place? Unexplainable. But we're here because of the ignorance of our divinity. Islam tells you this, that you are created by an all-powerful being. In some ways, there's a lot of overlap with Christianity. There is one God. That God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and creates you and specifically designs the universe and you specifically for a purpose. But that God is not intimate. In Islam, God is not an intimate being. He does not condescend to have a relationship with you in any meaningful sense. It is just you are the master and he is the master, we are the slave. That's how it works. So why he designs you is another issue altogether. So we'll get into that question. So the first answer as to how we got here. Second one, why are we here? In secular humanism, or in the atheistic framework, there is no objective purpose. What I mean by objective, of course, is that there has to be, something's objective, I should say, when it doesn't depend on your opinion. Like, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface atmosphere. That does not depend on your belief in it or not. Your belief that it doesn't boil, you say, I believe it boils at 211, is irrelevant. Your belief is irrelevant. The fact is the fact. That's objectively true. The idea that human beings have objective value shouldn't depend on human opinion. But if there is no beings above human opinion, like no God, then it has to depend on human opinion. So the question is this, how can you have objective value if there is no God? And the answer is, there isn't one. Remember what Stephen Jay Gould said? He said, we're here because of all these various acts of nature and the quirks of evolution and whatever else it might be, and that we may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists, and that this is superficially troubling, if not terrifying, and that we have to construct the meaning of life from our own wisdom and ethical sense. He's basically saying exactly what I just said. There is no answer. Why are we here in an objective sense? You have to make it up yourself. But that seems like a very despairing thing, doesn't it? You think for a moment of the tragedies. Maybe you faced some kind of serious loss in your life. And I can tell you story upon story of folks that I've met, and I've experienced my own sets of losses. We've always asked ourselves the why question. Why did this happen? Or was there any value or purpose behind that event, that bad thing that happened? And if the answer is no, it just happened, it's meaningless, there's something about that tugs at us. We're left with that. I can't remember the quote from Alicia's talk in referring to Peter Singer's interview, but the one atheist said, I agree with him wholeheartedly, but I couldn't help but leave with this sort of uneasy, sentimental anxiety. Something about that bothers us, that this is all for nothing. But when you look at Richard Dawkins, he'd tell you life is full of meaningless tragedies and meaningless good fortune. When asked what is the purpose of humanity, his words are, virtually verbatim, this: we are machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is every living object's sole reason for living. Every living object, that includes you. You're a DNA propagator, and that's all you are. You are a bag of chemicals with a bone structure that allows you to move around. But let me ask you this. When you got up to come to this morning, and you looked in the mirror, did you think to yourself, I am a well-dressed DNA propagator? You didn't do that. And many of you have held a baby in your arms, a newly born baby. And you look into that chubbiness, and you think to yourself, what a cute, pudgy DNA machine. I don't think you did that. You recognize something that is inherently flawed about this. But even you have to go past that and think of what the implications for atheism actually are. Lawrence Krauss, an astrophysicist out of Arizona State University, who believes that we are here basically by accident, essentially, says that when you ask human beings what they are, he calls us a bit of pollution. Cosmically speaking, we're pollution. If you got rid of us, the stars and galaxies and quarks and all these things wouldn't care. In his words, in the New York Times, I think it was, he said, we are completely irrelevant. That's amazing. Because we're always asking about relevance. How do we get a message that's relevant to the culture? Or how do we make the message relevant to the culture? Or how do we see our own relevance within the culture? He'd have to say, nope, there is no relevance. Because you're not here for any purpose objectively, just whatever you give it yourself. So why are we here? There is no why. There just is. Then you look at pantheism. Why are we here? Well, again, it's that ignorance of our divinity. There's the illusion of individuality, and you need to wake up from the illusion through the various means of karma, of working off your karma through yoga and meditations and various things and doing good deeds. You'll eventually work this off and realize your inner divinity. That's why you're here, to enlighten yourself through these means. Islam tells you, as I've already said, why are you here? You're here because you're just a slave of God. That's what you are. When you see that name Abdullah, you guys say it Abdullah. It's not how you say it. It's Abdullah. It literally means the slave of God. My name, Abdu, literally means his slave. That's what it means. Now, we believe in Christianity to being a bondservant to Christ. But in the Islamic concept, it's different than that. You are a slave to him in this sense. There are rules you follow. You follow the rules well, you get to go to heaven. If you don't follow them well, it's a different issue. So why are we here? We are here to worship him, and that's all there is to it. Third question, what explains the human condition? Why are things the way they are? And the answer is essentially this. From a secular humanist standpoint, things are the way they are because, one, evolutionarily speaking, everything is struggle. That's how we got here in the first place. Our species was born out of a struggle where nature is red in tooth and claw. And the dominant species, or the more favorable genetically species, given certain environments and certain random mutations and adaptations, will eventually succeed over and above the weaker or the slower or the more dim-witted, I guess. I don't know what the answer is on this one, but we'll eventually get more food than the other ones do, and we better ourselves this way. Or now, as human beings, we simply lack a proper distribution of resources. And if we just educate ourselves enough, we'll create a Star Trek existence where you speak to a machine and food pops out and no one will be hungry ever again. Won't need money anymore either. So why are we here? It's ignorance, lack of resources, and unequal distribution of these kind of things. And if we can just do it through social engineering. Pantheism, again, says, why is the way the world is? Why do you suffer? The reason you suffer is because of an ignorance of your divinity. And you need to recognize your connection with the universe. And suffering is an illusion. In fact, in Buddhism, one of the four noble truths you have to agree with in order to be a Buddhist, essentially, is you have to agree that life is suffering, but that suffering is an illusion caused by desire. And the illusion will cease when you let go of your desire, when you stop desiring, and you can do that by following the Eightfold Path. Of course, you don't recognize, I wonder if you see the inherent contradiction. If suffering is caused by desire, and you need to let go of your desire, you have to desire that, don't you? So there's a problem that you can't get rid of the inherent need, the inherent desire to be free of your own desire. That's why we suffer. But we hold on to these things, the past and the future and all these things, and this causes our problems. This causes our, these attachments. You can even see it in our popular movies. Take the Star Wars movies, for example. The whole idea of the Force is a pantheistic idea. The whole idea of the Force is pantheistic, that we all return eventually to this cosmic force that doesn't have a will of its own, or even a personality. We just return to this thing. And that it's the Jedi who relinquish attachment to the past and the future and don't hold on to any specific relationships because those things prevent you from becoming fully realized. That's pantheism. 100%. Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, actually talks about this and how we can be free of the pain in our lives. He says, enlightenment consciously chosen means to relinquish our attachment to the past and the future and dwell in the now. It means to dwell in the state of presence rather than in time. It means to say yes to what is. When you do that, you don't need pain anymore. How much more pain do you need, he says, until you are able to make that choice? How much more time before you can be free of pain? You see what he said? He said if you stop worrying about the past and the future and dwell in the now, you're fine. You'll be free of your pain because you won't have this attachment anymore, and you'll get enlightened. You'll be consciously enlightened. Now let me ask you this question. If you've lost something in your life, and people who've lost a child, for example, when they were young, when the child was young, or lost someone who was loved in their life, Eckhart Tolle tells you, relinquish your attachment to the past. Forget about that past you had with that child. And don't worry about the future you'll never have with that child. Just dwell in the now and you'll be fine. Well, you know what? The now is pretty awful. Can he be serious? He can't be serious about this because he's saying pain is an illusion. And the human condition is something you can wave away by wishful thinking. And Islam says the reason why we're in this mess is because we're not following the Islamic law properly. God gave us law. We fell from the Garden of Eden. That story is shared in Islam and Christianity. We fell from grace, as it were, and then we needed to work ourselves back to God's favor by following laws. Of course, the interesting contradiction here, or not a contradiction, but the inherent problem here is this. We couldn't follow one law, don't eat this fruit. Here's 600 more laws for you to break. How is that a fix? But that explains the human condition. We just need to educate ourselves in Islamic law and follow it more strictly. And then finally, the question of salvation, is there a better way? For the secular humanist and for the atheist, it's a matter of education and exploration through science and self-reflection. Read these words from Tom Flynn, who wrote on what secular humanism actually is. He's an atheist, and he says, secular humanism maintains that through a process of value inquiry informed by scientific and reflective thought, men and women can reach rough agreement concerning values, crafting ethical systems that deliver optimal results for human beings in a broad spectrum of circumstances. Now that's pretty, whoa, nice. Good job with that writing. But do you see what he said? Through value inquiry and scientific and reflective thought, we can come to rough agreement concerning values. You know, all you need to do is turn on the news for 5 minutes and realize that agreement is pretty rough. We seem to be willing to kill each other for any reason whatsoever, including newborn babies, because, well, they don't value their own life. We might as well just end them if they're inconvenient to us. It's a pretty rough agreement. It's hardly very smooth, and it's not very cohesive. And we're in the 21st century, and we still haven't gotten there. So that road to salvation seems to be a bit of a dead end. Pantheism tells us that if we exercise self-actualization, or we meditate enough, or do enough good deeds, and perform yoga, and all these other things, we can eventually realize the inner divinity and be free of this world of suffering, and the cycle of death and rebirth will end. We're not supposed to come back. We're supposed to be done coming back and go and be part of the absolute. And Islam says, if you do enough good deeds, you'll achieve heaven. You'll achieve heaven. So how do we get here? Why are we here? Why is here the way it is? And how do we get out of this mess? Those are the answers. Now, how does a Christian worldview answer these? And I've only got a little bit of time here to race through the Christian message on this. What I'm hoping to show you, though, in the first part is, if you understand the actual worldviews, it's impossible for you to say they all lead to the same road or they're all equally valid, because on every single question, they answer every single question differently, and radically so. So they can't all be the same. How does the Christian worldview answer these issues? Take the terms of origins, for example. Christian theism tells you that you are here because a God, a all-powerful, all-knowing God, creates you on purpose. You were designed, as it were. You were put together on purpose. But you know what's interesting about that? The Bible doesn't actually say that you were built or that you were even designed. When you read Psalm 139, what does it tell you? It tells you that you were knit together in your mother's womb. That's an interesting way to put it. Knit together? Doesn't that suggest something intimate about the way you were put together? Not just this sort of you were manufactured in a facility and out you were trotted like other ones just like you, but you're all unique. You're genetically unique. You're spiritually unique. because you were knit together. There's an intimacy there. When you think of the DNA molecule and what it is, there's 3.1 billion bits of information in every single human being's DNA, and they're all different. 3.1 billion bits of information across 6 billion or 7 billion people, all of which are woven differently to create a unique human being. There's information laced throughout all of it. Whenever we've seen information, we've seen an informer. That's our observation across the board. When there's information, we've seen an informer, and in DNA, you have the most staggering amount of information in one place in your body. And there are trillions of those in your cells. Yet you're here by accident? Or is it possible that that DNA molecule, as but one example, is the beautiful knitting together of a human being? You were knit. And it tells me something about your value. Because when you think about this, you were created on purpose, for a specific purpose. And there's a sentimental value to you that's not just merely sentimental, but objectively sentimental. Because if you were created on purpose, then that means there is a purpose for you and for me. And what is that purpose? This is one of those questions, and maybe you've heard me give this illustration before about the show Everybody Loves Raymond. You ever watch the show, Everybody Loves Raymond? In this television show, it's the story of this father who is sort of a bumbler. He kind of goofs up things all the time and messes them up, but he eventually gets it right in all this. Well, in this one particular show I happened to be seeing, I was traveling, and I like to have background noise on while I work, so I had this television show on that I was hoping wouldn't distract me so I could do some work, but for some reason it did distract me, so I watched the whole thing and got nothing done. In this show, his daughter asks him the question, like, where do babies come from? How did people get here? And so he's nervous, he goofs it up and says something about storks or something like that. And his wife's like, no, Ray, you can't let her believe that because she's going to find out the truth from somebody else. And if she finds that from somebody else, she won't trust us with the big questions of life. So go fix this. So half an hour later, he finally goes to fix it. He goes to her room, sits down, and says, honey, when two people come together, a man and a woman come together, and they love each other, and they're married, she goes, whoa, stop, Dad, stop. I know all that. I want to know, why does God put us here? He wasn't ready for that question because it's the meaning of life question, right? What's the meaning of life? This is the tough one no one seems to have an answer to. Every time someone tries to find the answer, it's always this guy who's like torn up because he climbed a huge mountain, and there's the guy sitting in the lotus position at the top of the mountain with the huge eyebrows, and he says, what's the meaning of life? And the guy opens his mouth, and the movie ends, or the custom commercial, or whatever it is. We don't know the answer. Well, she asks him, what's the meaning of life? And he says, God puts us here because heaven is crowded. It's ridiculous, of course, because no one knows the answer, supposedly. Well, we actually do know the answer to that. Why are you here? Why are you here? The answer is simple. The chief end of man is to glorify God and delight in his presence forever. You are to glorify a God who knits you together in your mother's womb, creates you essentially out of nothing, but then he creates you for the purpose of being with him forever. That's why you're here. He creates you for relationship. That's why you want it so badly. Everybody in this room wants relationships, has them, covets them, and protects them, or mourns when they're gone. You are an inherently relational being. Does a mindless universe explain that? Does a monistic God, like in the Hindu philosophies, does that explain it? Or a God who is one in nature and one in person, like the Muslims explain it? No. You know what explains why you and I want relationships so bad? Because you're the effect. The cause of you and I should reflect why we want relationships so bad. That's what the Trinity actually is. The triune God is one being in three personhoods, and those three personhoods in the one being exist eternally in community in the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, each one loving the other from eternity. He defines relationship, which explains why you want it so badly. And that also explains one other thing about the God of the Bible being, I think, so uniquely suited as an object of our worship. The God of the Bible creates you, not so that he can have relationship, but so that you can with him. He doesn't need relationship. He's already got it. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. He already has it within himself. Why does he create you? Not so that he can have it, but so that you can have it. It's an utterly selfless act. That's remarkable. Remarkable. How different. But what explains the human condition? Shortly and very briefly, the human condition, the reason why we have the world we have today is because we were created for that purpose, for relationship, and we chose on purpose to violate that purpose. We didn't say to God, thank you, we'd like to be with you. We said, no, we'd like to be you. And then we walked away from him altogether, and he let us have the consequences of our actions. We chose to walk away and to sin against him on purpose. And said, we don't want your way, we want our way. And from there, he gave it what we wanted. And this is the world we live in now because of that. That's why we are in the situation we are in. But that suffering is real, in complete distinction to what Hinduism says, or pantheism might say, that suffering is an illusion. It is real. When you suffer losses, you recognize that it's real. Your suffering is not an illusion. Do you feel like that in the middle of your suffering? Of course you don't. You need something to fix it. And the God of the Bible tells you that your suffering is so real that the one who creates all of reality actually experiences it for you on that cross. That's how real your pain and your suffering is. Your moral choices matter so much that something had to be done about them. They weren't irrelevant. Something had to be done, and the God of the Bible did something about it at Calvary's Hill. And that leads to the fourth question, the solution. Salvation. I've already alluded to it. That's what the cross actually is. It's the solution to the human problem. Every one of us has sin. Every one of us does. Every one of us has chosen to violate the purpose for which we were created, that relationship. And God himself lives a perfect life, experiences the pain on that cross that you and I can't bear to bear. He does it himself. He pays the penalty you deserve and then rises from the dead to show he has the power over life and death. You see, every other worldview is different. They're all different, every one of them, fundamentally so, except in this one way. The one way they're all the same. C.S. Lewis actually pointed this out. He said that we often will flee from what we think is the same old thing. We don't like the same old thing. We want something new and exotic, and so we think Hinduism and Islam and Buddhism and the New Age and all these things are exotic and cool, and Christianity is this dusty old thing that people with powdered wigs used to believe. But here's where everything else is the same old thing. Every one of them, if you notice this, secular humanism, pantheism, and Islam all tell you, you are the solution to your own problem. If you do enough good things, if you get educated enough, if you live a moral enough life, you'll fix everything. All of them teach the same thing. You can be your own solution. Christianity teaches something completely different and is uniquely, I think, true. Not only unique, but also uniquely true in this, is that it specifically says you can't be your own solution. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, Jesus says, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and slander. That's your heart and that's my heart. Here's what he tells you. He doesn't tell you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to hear. And what you need to hear is that you need someone who's not you to save you from you. And so do I. He's not interested in popularity. He's interested in telling you the truth. That's unique. No one else tells you that. By the way, that comports with logic. If you're the problem, and history tells us you are, and I am too, if we're the problem, how can we be the solution? We are fundamentally the problem. We need a solution outside ourselves. That's what the Christian message says. Let me wrap this up. These differences are such huge differences. Such huge differences. And postmodernism wants to tell you and tell me that when I point the differences out and use logic to do it, that it's a power move. It's a rhetorical power move to keep me from nailing you down. They say it's a power move. You know what the ironic thing about all this is in this postmodern effort to blur our differences? The incarnation of God in Christ and the atonement are responses to this power move. Postmodernism says that the power move of trying to point out the flaws prevents us from nailing down the truth. The incarnation and the atonement tells us that the truth incarnate was nailed down in response to the ultimate power move to try to subdue God. And through his power, you and I have life. That's the difference. Thank you, guys. God bless you.